Okay, so something about this Colombia earthquake genuinely does not add up when you first look at the numbers. And I want to walk you through it because once you understand what actually happened underground, the whole story changes. We're talking about a magnitude 7.4 that hit western Colombia, and the strange part right away is the depth. This thing tore loose 107 kilometers down. That's 66 miles beneath the surface. That is deep, deep enough that most people wouldn't expect buildings to come down from it at all. And yet above it, entire structures collapsed, and the numbers coming out now are honestly shocking. Thousands of homes gone, hundreds of lives lost. As of the latest count, 265 people are confirmed dead. More than 3,770 people are injured. Nearly 500 are still listed as officially missing. And get this, over 9,550 homes have been destroyed completely. So there's a lot to unpack here, and there's one question everybody keeps asking online right now. Venezuela got hammered by two massive earthquakes just weeks before this. Now Colombia gets hit with a 7.4. Are these connected? Is something bigger happening in the region? I looked into what the actual tectonics say, and the short answer is no. This is not some aftershock from Venezuela. It didn't rupture along the same fault, and deep beneath Colombia, something completely different was going on. Let me explain. The quake struck western Colombia on Monday morning, close to a town called San Jose del Palmar in the Choco department. New footage keeps coming in as rescue crews work through the damage, and more people are uploading videos of the shaking and the aftermath every hour. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the epicenter sat roughly 5 kilometers, about 3 miles east of the town of Choco. And here's where it gets interesting. At a depth of 107 kilometers, everything about how you interpret this earthquake changes. If you just glance at a map and see a dot over western Colombia, your instinct is to assume there's some major surface fault running right underneath it, right? That's the natural assumption. But the rupture wasn't anywhere close to the surface. It happened far below Colombia's crust, and that's really the first big twist in this story. The fault that actually broke almost certainly isn't something you'd find marked on a normal Colombian road map, nothing like the San Andreas fault out in California. I've touched on Colombia's fault systems in earlier videos, but this one is different, and I think it deserves a proper explanation because a lot of you have been asking which fault caused this. Here's the deal. This earthquake happened inside the Nazca plate itself. That plate begins out in the Pacific west of South America, part of that whole ring of fire system we always talk about. As it moves toward the continent, it dives underneath South America in what's called a subduction zone. But that descending slab of oceanic rock doesn't just stop at the boundary. It keeps sinking hundreds of miles down into the Earth's interior. And this magnitude 7.4 happened inside that sinking slab, not out at the offshore subduction boundary where you'd normally expect the action. If you look at the USGS map, there's a red line marking that offshore zone, and the quake wasn't on it. That's why this wasn't one of Colombia's typical shallow faults ripping open under a city. Seismologists have a specific term for this, an intermediate depth intraslab earthquake. Intraslab just means exactly what it sounds like, inside the slab itself. And that distinction actually matters a lot because right now there's no solid scientific basis for pointing at some named fault system on a map and saying that's what caused this. The rupture happened way underneath those familiar surface structures. If you look at the focal mechanism, the little beach ball diagram seismologists use, it shows mostly sideways strike-slip motion, similar in style to the San Andreas, just buried deep inside the Nazca plate instead. So naturally, the next question is, how does rock even break like that, more than 66 miles underground? Near the surface, rock is relatively cool and brittle. Stress builds up over time, and eventually something gives way, a fault slips, and you get an earthquake. But the deeper you go, temperature rises, pressure rises, and rock starts behaving very differently. Normally, you wouldn't expect quakes at that depth from ordinary crustal processes. But subducting plates are the exception because that descending slab stays relatively cold compared to the surrounding mantle, which lets it keep producing earthquakes at depths where you'd otherwise expect none. As that cold Nazca slab bends and sinks, stress keeps accumulating on it, and eventually a huge section slips all at once. A magnitude 7.4 means this wasn't some minor crack, this was a major rupture. And that leads to the next mystery. If the quake started 66 miles down, why did so many people feel it at the surface? We're talking about roughly 34 million people across 4 countries who felt the shaking. Here's the thing about depth. It generally reduces the intensity of shaking directly above the epicenter compared to an equally strong shallow quake, which is honestly why this wasn't the worst case scenario, even with everything you're seeing in the footage. But deeper earthquakes also spread their energy across a much wider area, and that's exactly what happened here. The shaking reached far beyond the immediate epicentral zone, all across western and central Colombia. Cali felt it, Pereira felt it, Manizales, Medellin, Bogota, all of it. The depth didn't stop the seismic waves, it just gave them a much bigger area to travel through. And once those waves reached the cities, what happened next depended entirely on local ground conditions and the buildings sitting on top of them. That's actually why earthquake damage can look almost random, kind of similar to how wildfire damage can jump around unpredictably, and there's a real explanation behind that pattern. One building stays standing while the one right next to it collapses. One neighborhood reports shattered walls while a nearby area looks completely fine. Soft sediment can amplify certain kinds of ground motion. There's liquefaction to consider. Different building heights respond differently to different shaking frequencies. And then you add in construction quality, the age of the building, how well it was reinforced, whether it had prior structural damage. A magnitude number alone can't tell you which specific building survives and which one doesn't. But Colombia now has real numbers showing just how widespread the vulnerability turned out to be. More than 9,550 homes reportedly destroyed, more than 25,800 families affected, and I want to be clear, that's families, not buildings. That's real people who lost their homes entirely, people whose homes are damaged but still standing, people sleeping outside right now, people waiting on an engineer to tell them whether it's even safe to walk back through their own front door. And here's the part that I think changes how dangerous this situation really is. The buildings that already collapsed are the obvious tragedy. But the buildings that almost collapsed might actually be the bigger threat going forward. A structure can survive the main shock and still be seriously weakened underneath. A connection can shift, a column can crack, part of a wall can lose support, a floor can shift out of place. Then the shaking stops and the building's still standing, so from the outside someone might think they got lucky. But Colombia has already recorded 130 aftershocks, and a weakened structure doesn't need another 7.4 to come down. It just needs enough additional movement to push an already damaged section past its remaining strength. That's exactly why families in places like Pereira and Cali are sleeping in tents in parks right now. Some genuinely have nothing left to go back to. Others are staying outside purely out of fear that their damaged homes could collapse during another tremor. And that same fear is shaping how the rescue teams are operating too. As for whether another quake of similar size could hit the same area, seismologists currently consider that unlikely, but low probability doesn't mean the aftershock sequence is over. The real concern right now isn't whether a second 7.4 arrives, it's what the aftershocks that are still happening could do to buildings that already absorb the full force of the main shock. And while engineers are worried about what's still standing, rescue crews are focused entirely on what's already on the ground. This is where it becomes a race against time. In Cali, teams are concentrated on 7 collapsed buildings where survivors could still be trapped. We're getting close to that critical 3-day window, the point where the chances of finding someone alive start dropping fast. As of Wednesday, search crews were still picking up possible signs of life beneath the rubble, using sensors, dogs, cameras, and stretches of complete silence to listen for movement or sound underneath the concrete. At some sites, they've actually had to limit how many volunteers are near the rubble because too many footsteps or too much machinery vibration can interfere with the sensors trying to detect someone trapped below. Picture that for a second. An entire rescue site going quiet because somebody buried underneath might be making a sound too faint to hear otherwise, maybe barely able to make any noise at all through the dust and the pressure around them. And Colombia has already proven that survival is possible in this kind of situation. In Pereira, 32-year-old Daniela Largo was pulled out alive after roughly a day and a half trapped inside a collapsed building. Her arm was pinned, and rescuers had to cut a narrow path through the debris just to reach her. A doctor was even able to give her fluids while she was still stuck. After hours of work, the crew finally freed her, and when she came out, the firefighters and everyone around the site erupted into celebration. That rescue matters so much because every single hour right now creates 2 very different outcomes underneath that rubble. Someone might still be alive down there, or rescuers might arrive just a little too late, or a weakened structure might collapse even further before help gets through. Generally, the first 48 to 72 hours after a collapse are considered the most critical window for finding survivors, though people absolutely can survive much longer than that depending on their injuries and how much air, water, and space they have around them. So 72 hours isn't some hard cutoff where searches just stop, but the clock is definitely ticking. There's another number here that needs to be handled carefully. Officially, nearly 500 people are listed as missing, but separate, informal civilian databases have collected more than 4,100 names. These two figures don't mean the same thing, though. Civilian lists can have duplicates. They can include people who simply lost phone service, people who left the area and haven't checked in yet, people who are actually fine and just haven't reached their families. The official count goes through a verification process the crowdsourced lists don't. So it wouldn't be accurate to say Colombia definitely has over 4,100 people missing or trapped. But those lists do tell you something real. Thousands of families have been desperately trying to locate someone since Monday, and that alone says a lot about the scale of this. And now there's another problem emerging. Some of the communities closest to the epicenter might also be the communities we know the least about, purely because of the geography. Choco isn't like central Cali. Much of that department is covered in dense jungle, steep mountainous terrain, and narrow roads, and some communities are only reachable by river. Cell service has gone down across the affected areas, which means damage reports aren't coming in the way they would from a city. When a building collapses in an urban center, you get videos, emergency calls, and rescue teams responding within minutes. But a remote community hit by that exact same earthquake might take authorities hours or longer just to establish contact. That's part of why the true scale of the impact in Choco is still hard to pin down. Communication with those areas simply isn't reliable right now. The terrain creates another danger, too. Western Colombia is extremely mountainous, and strong shaking can destabilize slopes and trigger landslides that block the very roads rescue teams need to reach people. Critical transportation routes are currently being assessed for both earthquake and landslide damage, and every new aftershock can force crews to reassess all over again, which costs precious time. This earthquake didn't just damage homes, it disrupted transportation, healthcare access, schools, and commerce, which is exactly the point where a natural disaster starts turning into a long-term reconstruction crisis. We're watching that same pattern play out in Venezuela right now. But there's still one lingering question hanging over this whole region. What's the actual connection to Venezuela? Back on June 24th, Venezuela was struck by two quakes just 39 seconds apart, a 7.2 followed by an even larger 7.5. That larger Venezuelan quake was shallow and involved strike-slip faulting near the boundary where the Caribbean plate slides past the South American plate. Compare that to Colombia, where this quake occurred roughly 107 kilometers down inside the subducting Nazca plate. Venezuela's event involved the Caribbean-South American plate boundary. Colombia's involved internal deformation within the Nazca slab itself. These are not the same rupture, not the same fault system. Now, could a major earthquake in one place add stress somewhere else? Sure, that's a real phenomenon. Large earthquakes can redistribute stress, and seismic waves can occasionally trigger activity at significant distances. But proving one earthquake actually triggered another requires solid evidence, and timing alone isn't proof of anything. South America isn't run by one single giant fault system. It's a patchwork of different boundaries and processes, and this appears to be its own separate event. I'll keep following this story as more information comes in because there's clearly still a lot unfolding on the ground in Colombia. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.